Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, I've got a really special one indeed. We are jumping into a couple of different sour beers out of Belgium, and I tell you, one I've never had I expect is going to be insane, and one is my absolute favorite of the style. So today we're going to be starting with the Lindeman's Framboise. This is a raspberry lambic, 2.5% ABV, so very, very low. This is out of Framboise, Belgium. The second beer for today's review is Boon Brewery's Oude Geuze Boon Black Label. It's 6.4% ABV out of Lambic, Belgium. This won the gold medal at the World Beer Cup in 2016. So I have never had this one. I got it from Tavour, though I think you can find this reasonably readily at a well-stocked shop and certainly at Total Wine. This one is pretty easy to find. You can get this almost anywhere that has a decent selection of Belgian beers. And this is hands down my favorite Framboise of them all. So I'm really excited to jump into these today, and we're going to do just that. Getting started with the Lindeman's Framboise Raspberry Lambic at 2.5% ABV. Okay, jumping into our first beer of today's Belgian sour review, we have Lindeman's Framboise. This is a raspberry lambic, 2.5% ABV out of Framboise, Belgium. Okay, before we jump into this beer, a little background on lambics. Lambics are to the world of beer as champagne is to the world of sparkling wine. Champagne is only champagne and can only be called champagne if it's from the Champagne region of France. The same is true of lambic beers. They are only produced and can only be called lambics if they come from a specific region of Belgium, specifically the Pajottenland region, which is in Flanders, just southwest of Brussels. Now, we've talked about Belgium and the regions and the languages, etc., in multiple different videos, but it's worth mentioning here. The city name in which this beer comes from is Flezenbeek, which is a Dutch pronunciation. This beer I called a framboise, which is the French pronunciation of the word raspberry. If you use the Dutch pronunciation, it's actually framboise, which is totally different. Most people still will call it framboise, but either are correct. You could make an argument, since this is from Flanders, the Dutch-speaking region of Belgium, that it would be more correct to use framboise. But bearing in mind, this is also just southwest of Brussels, where they speak both Dutch and French. I know it's confusing, but it's worth mentioning. Nonetheless, we're going to get started and get this poured right in the glass. I have had this beer many, many times, and I'm excited to jump in with a super critical eye here. And yep, it is just a lovely beer to behold every time. A very, very deep ruby red. It's very, very effervescent. Absolutely lovely to look at in the glass. Very low ABV, so you can have some of this and not worry too much. I can see the effervescence, though it's a deep, deep ruby red, bordering on purple. And the head that it forms, it does form a head. Typically, it will settle down, but it typically has this rather light pink color to it. And this is a very pungent aroma for a beer. I can smell it from here. I don't have to get near the glass. It smells strongly of raspberry. I cannot emphasize how pungent the raspberry aroma is from this lambic. It smells phenomenal. And once you get close to it, I mean, it's just pungent raspberry. And that classic lambic sour and tartness that mixes with the raspberry. Raspberry is a really good fruit for a lambic because of the natural traits of the fruit. It just pairs so well with the natural traits of the beer style. Lambics are fermented open by wild and natural yeast in the region, is how they're produced traditionally. And it's one of the reasons that only beers from that specific region can be called lambics, because that's where the specific microbial and yeast strains are that all get in to make the beer what it is. Nonetheless, this is settled beautifully. I'm going to jump in for a sip. Oh, every time. It's such a phenomenal beer. Okay. You get it in your mouth, and the very first thing that hits you is just how pungently raspberry forward this beer is. I mean, it is pungently raspberry flavored beer. And the natural tang that you get from a raspberry, that kind of sweet and tart and tangy quality, just pairs beautifully with the natural tang, sweet, tart quality of a lambic beer. And they just completely meld together in perfect harmony. One complements the other, and it's very pungent. You get that pungent, tart, sour tang up front, then it opens into the beautiful sweetness of the natural fruit that pairs with the beer, and then it has a super clean finish. Lambics tend to have a bit of a dry finish, and this is no exception. And this beer is a sweeter beer. I believe that they sweeten them. Naturally, obviously, as it's fermenting, there's a lot of sugars naturally in the malt, plus the raspberries for the yeast to eat. But at a low ABV, perhaps that wild yeast strain doesn't convert all of the sugars to alcohol. I'm not really sure. I'd have to do more research on that end of it. But it does have a sweet quality about it. So this is kind of what I would term a dessert beer, though you could make an argument this would be a good hot summer day beer because it's so light and crisp and refreshing. Body-wise, it's super light. I mean, ridiculously light. The mouthfeel is ridiculously creamy and effervescent. And just all that sweet and sour and sartan tanginess and just bright raspberry, just fruit flavor forward. It's such a beautiful mix of all of these different character traits. And it has this beautiful sweet finish that's just lush with raspberry. Just taste of ripe, lush raspberry and nice little dryness to the end. And even though it's a dry finish and all of it that goes into it, you don't actually expect, but the raspberry is so pungent. It's got a pretty long finish. Typically on a drier finish, they don't last as long as a wetter finish because there's not as much viscosity for the flavors to stick around, but this is so pungent, it does have a pretty long finish considering what it is. Fantastic beer. I absolutely love it. I am going to take my sweet time enjoying every last drop of this while I work up my scores. When we come back, we will get to the Boon Brewery, Oude Geuze Boon Black Label, 6.4% out of Lambic, Belgium. Okay, now moving on to our second beer of today. It is the Boon Brewery's Oude Geuze Boon Black Label, 6.4% out of Lambic, Belgium. This was the 2016 Gold Award winner at the World Beer Cup. Before I get jumping into this, let's get to this beer style and its pronunciations. This is a Belgian brewer, and I am basing it on the Flemish, which is the Dutch Belgian pronunciation, not the French. There's two ways to pronounce this, and it's spelled differently if it's French versus if it's Belgian. This is the Belgian spelling, the Flemish Belgian spelling, not the French. So this is Dutch spelling. So the name of this beer, O-U-D-E, is Oude, and then the word, I'll just pronounce it, it's Geuze. The G letter in Dutch is called G. It's got this guttural sound that's done, it's not at the front of the mouth, it's in the back, with the very back part of your tongue touching the top of the palate and almost rolling but with air pressure. So it's, the letter is pronounced G, and this word is pronounced Geuze. And it's not oo, it's not it's not it's kind of a hybrid of all the sounds that EU, so it's Geuze. It's almost an H but with a in the back, like the letter G is pronounced in Dutch. Now, if you're using the French pronunciation of this word, it's Geuze. Same thing. They pronounce the G, the E is silent, so there's no on the end, but the EU in the middle is pronounced like a combination of oo and It's neither. It's kind of in the middle. It's Geuze. Geuze. It takes practice to pronounce, but nonetheless, we'll be using the Dutch pronunciation, so it's Oude Geuze Boon Black Label at 6.4%. So, nonetheless, label art, not much really so to speak, but we're going to go ahead and get this poured right in the glass. I'm going very gently, as I did indeed expect this to be quite effervescent, and it is. Okay. That looks textbook, and yes, indeed, it's very, very effervescent. Formed a really thick, creamy head here. Very, very fine champagne-like bubbles. This head is going to break away relatively quickly because it is so effervescent, even though the carbonation is very, very fine. I can already, as I'm sitting here, see it collapsing quite quickly. This beer is pungent. I can smell it from here. It smells like a combination of sour and tart, and also ripe, fresh fruit, notably apples. Oh, yeah. Oh, that smells absolutely lovely. Indeed, what I smelled from, a foot away, once you get above the glass, like anywhere near it, you can really smell it quite strongly. It smells very pungent, very sour, very tart, and very much like fresh apples. I would say Granny Smith's would be the best because they're the more tart. That's what it smells like. Smells great. Honestly, I can't wait to jump in this. I'm going to break this head down just a little more with my finger. So I can get that head just a little more out of the way. That looks great. All right, let's jump in. Give it a sip. Oh, that's really nice. Pungently tart, pungently sour. Got a nice bit of funk. You could smell it on the aroma, though it did get drowned out a bit by the overabundance of the tart and sour aroma that came through, and also the apple aroma. This is quite an interesting and complex beer. It's got a dry finish, very dry finish, which is rather typical for this style. And it's got this flavor quality that puts me in mind of wine or champagne. It's got this brute-like fermented grape quality to it. It's very, very complex, the layers of flavor. It's hard to describe because it's such an interesting combo of flavors that kind of mixes with the aroma, but then it kind of turns and goes in its own direction. You can kind of smell a hint of that wine champagne-like edge to it on the aroma, but it comes through very, very prominently in the flavor here. Let's jump in for body and mouthfeel. The body, even though it's 6.4, feels quite light, probably medium light, truth be told. The mouthfeel is wet when it's first in your mouth, but then it's immediately dry, and there's no viscosity at all. The finish is not super long, and that's very common with beers that have a dry finish to them, especially if they have a lack of viscosity, just due to the nature of the beast. It just kind of pulls all the flavors away so it finishes cleanly, which is how it's supposed to. And in fact, there's a little bit of info on the back of this bottle here. I'm just going to read some of this off. The driest Geuze that they make, notes of green apple and grapefruit. Okay, I definitely got the green apple, Granny Smith's. Grapefruit, not as much, but everybody has their own sensory experiences. But yeah, so very dry, and definitely apple for sure. Gosh, this is very, very good. This is a refreshing beer. It's just pungent, tart, sour funk, opening into really just this appley, funky, kind of straw, hay, kind of barnyard-like flavor profile that just kind of blends with all of it. This beer goes in a lot of different directions. It's very, very interesting indeed. If you're a big fan of sour beers or tart beers, and specifically beers that have been brewed with Brettanomyces or any other native wild yeast that imparts that kind of funk and barnyard and all those kind of different elements that just add so many layers to beer, you will very, very much indeed most likely like this. If you're not, it's so pungent, I would suggest it's probably not for you. If you don't like the funk in a beer, this one is probably over the top, and I would say it's probably not for you. But if you do, this is one of the best examples I've ever had. This is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, come up with my scores, and when we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to thoroughly enjoy both of these beers, and I do really mean thoroughly enjoy both of these beers, we're going to get them both ranked top to bottom. Starting with the Lindeman's Framboise, or Framboise, if you want to use the Dutch pronunciation, borrowed from the French framboise for raspberry. 2.5% ABV out of Fleisenbeek, Belgium. Starting with the aroma on this one is so pungent. It's one of those rare special lambics. It just hits you from, I mean, a foot plus away. It's perfect 10 out of 10. Taste on this. Typically, lambics are sour. They're tart. They can have some funk flavors, but the fruited lambics tend to be significantly sweeter. And this is an excellent example of that specific way that they can finish off a lambic. And it pairs so well with the raspberries, and the natural fruit choice just brings out the natural tartness and tang that you get in a lambic, and it pairs so well. Lindeman's is my favorite example of a framboise. I give it a 10 out of 10 for the taste. Body on this was a textbook perfect lambic body. They can run the gamut very low ABVs from about 4 to, really it swings, some can get up even into the 8s, believe it or not, but in general it's a lower ABV beer style, and 2.5, this is on the lower end, but it's certainly in range. And it had the body I expected for having an ABV at that mark, and it certainly was textbook lambic. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Mouthfeel on this was fantastic. Lambics can run the gamut, but the common character trait that they all have in common is they're very, very effervescent beer styles, and they tend to have very tight, very fine champagne-like carbonation bubbles. So the mouthfeel is very, very light and very, very creamy, as well as effervescent. And this hit all three of those marks. It gets a 10 out of 10. Finish on this one. Lambics, as a rule, don't have the longest finish in the world. Typically, the fruited ones will have a little bit longer finish just because the fruit presence will add some natural kind of staying power to the flavor profile. This is well above average, but not the highest of high ends in the lambic realm. It gets an 8 out of 10. Head and retention. Head and retention on lambics can kind of run the gamut as well. As we know, they're very effervescent and they're very champagne-like, and it really just depends on how much activity there is. Typically, they're not quite as active in head formation and retention as I saw in this one, but it was still within spec. I gave it above average. I gave it a 7. Appearance-wise, absolutely gorgeous lambic, and to be a framboise full of raspberry, it was that classic deep ruby red. It nailed it, 10 out of 10. For the balance, I absolutely loved it. The balance of the base lambic beer style, where you get that sour and you get that tart, and then adding in the raspberry on top of that, and it just paired beautifully, and they balanced one another. Neither one overpowered the other. It was a perfect balance of raspberry and the base lambic beer. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. Feeling intangible, as I stated going into this, you might well already know, this is literally my favorite framboise lambic of them all. I give it a perfect 10 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, there are quite a few framboise lambics and other similar styles that go framboise, trying to play the part of a lambic, though they can't be lambics if they're not brewed in the Pas-Jutland region, just southwest of Brussels in Belgium. It's a very specific region. If it isn't from there, it cannot call itself a lambic, but there's many, many beers that are brewed in the same style and the same spirit, American and other European and other counterparts. But this, for my money, as a proper Framboise Lambic, this is the best. I gave it a 10 out of 10 for example of the style. That brings the total score on the Lindeman's Framboise to 95 out of 100. A very, very high score. If you've never had a Framboise Lambic or you've never had the Lindeman's, I highly recommend it. There's several out, but this one is for sure my favorite. It is just the best balance and I think the best example of the Framboise Lambic style. Moving on to our second beer today. Also another Lambic. Boon Brewery. I should make an amendment to all of the errors I made when I was describing this beer and reviewing this beer. I was so intently focused on explaining the correct pronunciation of the word Geuze that I didn't catch there's an E on the end of the first word in this beer's name. There are two correct pronunciations and spellings of the word old in Dutch. One is Oude, such as in Oude Brown. You'll see O-U-D, Oude, B-R-U-I-N, pronounced brown in Dutch, which is old brown, literally what it means in that sour specific style of beer. But in this one, they use the alternate spelling, which is O-U-D-E, pronounced Oude, just like the word Geuze has an E on the end. E's are pronounced in Dutch just as they are in German on the end, and they make that sound. So it's Oude Geuze Boon Black Label, 6.4%. This one's out of Lambic, Belgium. Winner 2016 World Beer Cup, gold medal. The aroma on this one, just as with the Lindeman's Framboise, this was one of those super pungent aromas. You could smell it from well over a foot away. Absolutely got a 10 out of 10. It was pungent. Taste on this. This is a prime example of a Geuze. It was so well done. I mean, they can kind of run the gamut. Before one on the more brute side, this was so complex. I absolutely loved it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Body on this one. For a 6.4, that's on the higher end of the Geuze or Geuze, depending on if you're talking French, Belgian. If we're on the end of the spectrum. And I actually expected it to have a bit more robust body than it did, but it was certainly well above average. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Mouthfeel, this was a textbook mouthfeel, and knowing that they were going for a brute-sided Geuze, I did give it the perfect 10 out of 10. I think it deserved it. Finish on this one. Now, I teeter-tottered on this because typically if you have a dry, brutish finish on a beer, the finish is not going to have as much staying power as a wetter, more viscous mouthfeel beer just due to the nature of the beast. But certainly this was above average for a drier, brute-like finish. I gave it a 7. Head and retention on this one, similar to the Lindeman's, it was very, very active. The head on this one wasn't quite as insane, and when I did break it down with my finger, it settled a bit. And yeah, of course, it's going to keep creating because it's such an effervescent style, but it didn't get out of hand. I gave it an 8 out of 10, well above average. Appearance-wise, this was textbook Geuze, if we're talking French. I don't have to keep saying it. I'm just going to refer to it by the Dutch. It nailed it. Perfect 10 out of 10. Balance on this. As a Geuze, this was beyond well balanced. I really, really appreciated all of the intense upfront tart and all of the sour and that classic barnyard funk that you get from that wild yeast with which they are fermented. And this also had that incredible kind of green, Granny Smith-like tart apple quality in both the aroma and the flavor, but then they all mixed and none of them really outdid one another. For me personally, I would have just liked a little more and a little more intense sour and tart to give it perfect, but it was just shy. I gave it a 9. Feeling intangible in this one, I absolutely loved it. I have had many a Geuze over the years, and this one certainly is among the best. Is it the best I've ever had? No. But it was not far off, and I give it a 9 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, taking into consideration a few of the prior points I made, I did give it a 9. Really just a little more sour, a little more tart, and a little bit bigger body for the ABV that it had. I probably would have kicked it up, but very, very good score. It gets the 9. That brings the total score on the Boon Brewery's Oude Geuze Boon Black Label to a 90 out of 100. So another very, very high score. Both of these Lambic beers are ridiculously good beers. You cannot go wrong with either of them. Completely different. Though they are both Lambics, they are completely different. Everything about them is different. This is sweet and fruity, and this is one of my go-to beers. If somebody tells me, oh, I don't like beer. Well, I posit that everybody likes beer because the world of beer is so vast and it runs such a gamut of aromas and flavor profiles that anybody claiming they don't like beer, they just haven't tried the right beer for them yet. This is my go-to because most people that say they don't like beer, they don't like the bitter side of beer. So you give them something sweet and sparkling and typically they're a convert. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't know. Yeah. And have you ever tried a milk stout? I mean, yeah, this is one of my de factos. It's a fantastic beer, and absolutely the Boon is in its own right, but this is a completely different end of the spectrum. This is for people, I think, that are deeper into the world of craft beer, that have had more exposure, that are a bit more explorative. This is full of funk. If you don't like the Brettanomyces type character where it gets that funky barnyard, you can get that in some saisons as well, but it's very pungent. This is a beer for people that know what they're getting into, and if you like that and you like the style, then hands down, I think you would enjoy it. But nonetheless, folks, that's today's review. As always, I sincerely appreciate you tuning in. Don't forget to like and comment. Please do comment. I want to hear from you. Subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you want to keep in the loop and know exactly when our videos go live, just click the notification bell next to the subscribe button. It will let you know right when they go live to YouTube. Till next time, folks, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.